Hey there, guys. Welcome to Anthony Reviews, where Anthony reviews. And I've got a pretty cool video for you guys today. I was lucky enough to interview the one and only Pixel Dan. Now, if you're familiar with the sort of toy reviewing community, I'm sure you've heard of Pixel Dan before. He's been around for quite a bit in terms of the YouTube toy reviewing world, if you will. He reviews mainly He-Man stuff, Ninja Turtle stuff, but a lot of other brands as well. And so in this interview, we talk about his sort of reviewing career, what he thinks about a lot of his favorite brands right now, a little bit of wrestling stuff. It's fun. So I certainly hope you enjoy my interview with Pixel Dan. Take a look. So, Pixelated Daniel, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you being here on the channel with Anthony Reviews. How are you doing, man?
Using my proper name, I see, huh? I'm good, man. I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Hey, no problem. Yeah, I'd say, does anyone ever call you Pixelated or your full,
Yeah,
YouTube given name?
that's not very often. That's when I'm in trouble, maybe.
Right.
Pixelated Daniel, you bought another toy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, I understand that. It's that in trouble sort of sound to it.
Yeah.
Obviously with the name Pixel Dan, that incurs some sort of video game sort of style to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, you've been on YouTube for quite a while now. I would say if anyone knows
Yes.
you, they know that.
Yeah.
Was your Pixels to Plastic? That was your first
That was it.
series? That was the
Yep, from
first
pixels
one?
to plastic. Yep. That was kind of that was my introduction to YouTube basically. That's when I first started doing videos.
Right. So so with that series, like that was 2008, right? That
Yes,
was when
2008. I think maybe I probably started it around the end of '07, but '08 was definitely when that really got going. Yep.
right. So what made you in terms of doing it then? Because obviously for someone like me, I got into the toy collecting scene around 2009 because there were people like you doing reviews. I sort of saw that happening. So for you, what made you grab a camera and start uploading and say, okay, I'm going to be making content? Back then, I guess it was just videos. Nowadays, it's
Yeah.
content. But
Yeah, it was very different.
what made you
It's
go, okay, I got to start doing this? This is what I want to do.
Yeah, so I think it's funny because I think a lot of the guys who started around the same time as me have a very similar story and similar points of inspiration. But it was around that time I had really gotten into watching YouTube was like brand new at this time. Like people making their own content was like a new thing and it was exciting. So I was really into guys like James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd,
Right.
who was still the angry Nintendo nerd back then. And like finding his stuff. I think I found his content on MySpace originally. So there's something else that dates this whole
Golly.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then like it sort of opened this door to like all of a sudden I'm finding all these other guys who are doing like this really cool retro video game content. And I was really drawn to it because that's something else that, was a big part of my childhood was Nintendo and Super Nintendo and all that stuff. So watching these guys just talk about all this stuff from my childhood and bringing up this nostalgia and these warm fuzzy feelings and making me remember how great all that was a real inspiration for me to want to do something similar. And I've always been a toy collector. I've always been big into buying action figures basically ever since I had my own job and had my own money. I was buying my own toys, right? I was
Right.
buying my own things to collect. And so it was kind of one of those things where I knew I wanted to do something like they were doing, but I knew that I didn't want to do the same thing. I wanted to find a way to distinguish myself, to differentiate myself. And I didn't want to be like another angry video game reviewer or anything like that. I wanted to find
Right.
my own thing that I was passionate about, that I felt like I could share with everybody. And so I decided to start dabbling in filming toys, talking about stuff from my own personal toy collection that I had at the time. And the video game side of it came as a way for me to try to latch on to the popularity of the retro video game
Oh,
content that was out there. So
right. Okay.
I found a way to do my own thing that still fit that niche, which is where I came up with From Pixels to Plastic. I talked about toys that were based on video games
Right.
and
Oh
it
my
and it
gosh.
worked. It worked. I mean,
Yeah.
I was featured on like screwattack.com was kind of the first place that really started featuring some of the stuff that I was doing, and they were huge at that time. I mean, that was James Rolfe's home at the time, and they were
Yeah.
kind of like the big name in the space. So like getting my video seen by their audience was one of those like kind of mind-blowing things. Like I couldn't believe so many people were watching the stuff that I was doing. And then that's what led me to joining up with RetroWare TV and the RetroWare guys. And that's how I met a lot of those guys who are still doing stuff today, like Norm, the gaming historian. I'm pretty good friends with him
Yeah.
because we started together back on RetroWare back in the day. So that's kind of how the whole thing started. Like, and that's where the Pixel Dan name comes from. I know people ask me all the time why that's my name, because it doesn't seem to fit all the He-Man stuff that I talk about.
Right.
But it came from that. That was my origin into this whole thing. So yeah, it was really, really fun. And it was fun being there. Like, you know, things were so different back then, like we always talk about, and just kind of watching everybody figure it out and being a part of that. I mean, it was fun. It was really fun back then.
Oh yeah, sure. It's a totally different beast nowadays, I would
Yeah.
say. It's completely different. Was there ever a point, you know, you sort of mentioned that like Pixel Dan doesn't evoke the sort of He-Man, Master of the Universe sort of mentality. You know, you expect more like Dan or something like
Yeah.
that. Uh,
Yeah.
was there ever a point where you thought maybe early on where things were starting to pick up that you thought, hey, maybe I still have time to change it? Or were you just always committed to the Pixel Dan
Once
motif?
No, actually, once I committed to Pixel Dan, I felt like that was it. Because it's really funny, and you can probably still go back and like see some of like the first episodes of From Pixels to Plastic I did. I actually introduced myself as my online screen name at that point, which was Mandalorian 30.
Yeah.
I
Which would
was
be
way
more
ahead. I
relevant
was
now. Yeah.
way ahead of the relevancy of the word Mandalorian, right? So like the first several episodes, I'm like, oh, my name's Mandalorian 30, because like back then screen names were like, you know, all your message boards and everything, you had a screen name.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was a few episodes in that my buddy Lance, who's one of the co-owners of RetroWare TV back then, he started like referring to me as Pixel Dan, like in personal emails and stuff.
Right.
And I
Okay.
was kind of like, that's like marketable. I like that. It's easier to say than Mandalorian 30. It's catchy. And like, so like I asked him, I was like, is that like, can I like use that? Like, you named me. Can I use that? And of course he was okay with it. And at that point, I just kind of decided like that's my brand, I guess. Before brand was really even a thing we were thinking of. Like I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
decided like this is it. This is the brand. I'm Pixel Dan. It's easy. It's people can remember that, you know. So it's how it came. That's how it came about. And I never really thought about changing it after that. I just stuck with it.
Right. I mean, obviously it works. You know, you get away from the sort of Star Wars motif and just have your own
That's right. Yeah.
idea and persona, and you know, it's easy, it's short, it's sweet, totally makes sense.
Right,
So
right.
you
Could you
you sort
imagine if I was still named Mandalorian 30 today? Like I couldn't imagine like cease and desists and stuff. Like Disney would
yeah,
be like, "Hey, sir, you can't you can't be using that."
there's an expectation with that too. Everyone comes to your channel
Right.
like, all right, we got to see the new retro wave of Mandalorian
That's
figures, and
right.
meanwhile you're talking about these
Can't
like
wait to see all his
Mondo
Baby Yoda
figures. Yeah,
videos. Yeah.
exactly. The Baby Yoda channel.
I'm sure those exist.
Sticking in your sort of earlier years, you know, you talked about finding your way in a lot of different places like Screw Attack and whatnot.
Yeah.
Do you think there was a video in particular where you felt like, oh my God, this is picking up way more than your previous ones? Like you sort of felt the momentum start to build.
I think one of the biggest successes I had early on was the Pac-Man board game. That was what that became probably the biggest episode of From Pixels to Plastic I ever did, and that came after the move to YouTube, right? So that's the other thing I think I kind of forget about, or everybody forgets about. But like in those early days, we weren't posting our videos on YouTube yet because the restrictions were so like, you know, you can only have a 10-minute long video,
Yeah.
and it was harder to work within those parameters. And also people weren't going to YouTube yet to watch videos. Like if you wanted your stuff to be seen, you had to try to get featured on the front page of a website or something. Like somebody had to
Yeah.
put your video out there, because that's how that's how traffic was still being driven. So after the YouTube stuff really started kind of picking up, the Pac-Man board game episode, I don't know if it like got picked up by like Pac-Man groups or websites or something, but that video was huge for me, and it got like some of the highest view counts that I had ever seen at that point, and that was like mind-blowing. And it actually drove me to like try to do more in the board game space too, because there's so many cool retro video game board games out there. I think the first one I covered was Donkey Kong, but then there was like Pac-Man, and I did like Cubert, and there was one based on off of like Nintendo's Popeye arcade game. It's crazy.
Right.
Of course, none of them did as well as that Pac-Man one. That's where I kind of learned, oh, sometimes you're just gonna have a topic that like takes off as a fluke, and you're not gonna know why. It's just gonna happen sometimes.
Right. Yeah. You didn't think you're like this is it.
Yeah,
Retro board game, like
that's it.
80s arcade
That's what I
stuff.
gotta do. Yeah, that's oh, never mind. That was a one-off. I accept that. I'll just keep moving forward. So yeah.
Oh man, that's awesome. Well, I would say people probably know you for two specific lines. Well, not lines,
Yeah.
but like brands, I would argue. And that's He-Man and Turtles.
Yes.
Obviously
Yes.
you were able to release a book with a
It was
last year, was it? You've
2
got
years
your
ago now, I think, or
couple
a
years. Oh
little.
my gosh, has
Yeah,
it really been?
I can't believe it's been. I think it released in early 2021, so it's been almost 2 years.
I could have
Yeah.
sworn it was like early 2020, like this time last year, but if it was
It
2 years
feels like
ago,
it. Yeah. It
okay.
was it was towards, I remember, because it was still like things were still kind of like shut down when it came out, and I was
Right, okay.
or like things were just starting to open back up again when it came out, because I was so worried about not being able to like get out there with my book because things were the way they were. So yeah, that's how I'll always remember it came out, like right as things were starting to open back up again.
Right. So yeah, that so it's sort of for those of you who are unaware, it's a time of publication, a comprehensive history of the sort of He-Man and Masters of the Universe toy lines, multiple toy lines. It's not just
Yes.
the retro stuff. It's not even just like figures. Like you've got all sorts of like stuff in there, correct? Like it's
Yeah.
like the whole world, which
So
is phenomenal.
it's all of the officially released Mattel Masters of the Universe toys that were released in the US. So it's everything from 82 all the way through, I think 2019 was our cutoff, which was the end of the classics toy line, the Masters of the Universe classics toy line. So yeah, it's figures, vehicles, play sets, some role play, weapons and accessories, all of it's in there.
Yeah, that's wild. Whenever you were going through this, 'cause obviously you're a child of the 80s, you know, you're talking about all the retro gaming and He-Man being so popular for you. Well, when you were going through that, was there a clear stop off where the nostalgia sort of ended and you were like, okay, now I'm going to be learning more than what I ever knew about stuff, doing research on these toys? Because obviously, you know, sometimes you weave in and out of brands. I don't know exactly what was your stopping point, but like what was that point where it was like, okay, now I get to relearn things?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really great question. For me, my weak spots for this book, were there was two of them. One of them was She-Ra, Princess of Power, and that was more in the sense that like those the He-Man toy line and the She-Ra toy line were like specifically driven towards the boys market and the girls market back in the 80s, right? So
Right.
I didn't have a lot of experience with the She-Ra toy line. Like I actually did have a couple of She-Ra figures as a kid. I had Bo and Cowl, for sure, but I didn't have a lot. I remember playing She-Ra with a neighbor, a girl that lived next door to me, like as a kid. She had She-Ra toys. So working on this book, this was this was like a full learning experience for me with She-Ra. In fact, I actually, hired somebody who was very knowledgeable about She-Ra to help with the writing for that section of the book, because I wanted to make sure it was all accurate and, it was being
Right.
properly represented in the book. But my favorite part of that was like I got to visit a collector, a huge She-Ra collector who had everything we needed to photograph for the book. So like the weekend that I spent with her photographing everything was like me really digging into that toy line for the first time, and it was so cool. It was so cool. Like, this is a toy line I missed as a kid because, it was for girls or whatever. But like here I am as an adult man totally blown away by the fact that there's all these different outfits you can put She-Ra in.
Right, right.
Seeing like what they all look like, and stuff like that. Because I had to include all that in the book, and I had to get pictures of
Yeah.
all these different the fantastic fashions, all the different outfits that they made for She-Ra and her friends. And but also there was like really cool play sets and stuff like that for that toy line that I never had any experience with before. So that was a lot of fun. The other one that was a lot of fun to really get in and play with and photograph for this book was the 1989 He-Man line, or what most people call the New Adventures of He-Man.
Right.
That was like Mattel's first attempt to try to bring He-Man back in the early 90s, which was, I mean, it did not work. It was a failure, but it was like He-Man in space is the best way to explain the toy line.
Right.
And it's very different from the original toy line, which is part of the reason it probably didn't catch on. So a lot of people have always looked at that as like the black sheep of the Masters of the Universe, collecting space. Like that's the weird one. That's the one that nobody likes or nobody had. But when you really get in there and like look at those for what they are, like even try to separate it a little bit and just look at them for the toys that they are, they're very well designed. There's a lot of really cool play features. They did a lot of cool stuff with the play sets and vehicles where they were modular and they can combine or be taken apart and put together in different ways. And I didn't know any of that stuff really until I got a chance to get in there and start researching and photographing. It was really fun, really fun.
Yeah. I mean that of course, I mean it makes the most sense, especially with the older sort of stuff where it is undeniable in terms of being the sort of boy girl driven markets, and you imagine those Toys R Us sort of aisles and
Yeah,
the very stark pinks and blues, and and that's something where obviously anyone can buy anything, but it is part of that history of where that was
absolutely.
clearly driven, that there's a company that very much had in mind of like, we got to capture a certain part of the the market that isn't playing with these
Right.
toys.
Right. I mean, like that's the thing. Like when you look at those shows, right? The He-Man and She-Ra shows, they're not very different from each other. In fact, I
Yeah.
would even say that the She-Ra series is the better of the two shows as far as like writing and the story arcs and everything goes.
Right.
But the toys were very different things. The He-Man toys were action figures with vehicles and play sets, and the She-Ra toys were dolls with hair that you could brush and different clothes that you can put on. So like that's just the way they were marketing stuff like that back then.
Right. Right. That's interesting. Talking about the He-Man cartoon, because obviously the cartoon is just as much of this, if not like one of the biggest pieces, besides the toys, of the sort of He-Man brand. As far as the cartoon goes, it's Filmation. It's a very specific kind of cartoon, even different from some of the later '80s stuff, like the more Transformers, GI Joe.
Mhm.
It has a very specific feel. So in terms of people who maybe have not like seen the show or aren't familiar with it, what is it about that He-Man that latches on with fans that made it so big? Even though when you look back at it, it's such a, I don't know, like it seems very easy to say like, oh, it's cheesy or it's simple, but
Yeah.
it's got like, I don't know, it's got like a weird alien feel to it, does it not?
It
When
it
compared to some of these
does.
other ones?
Well, and that's kind of one of the things that I always point at with Masters in general, not just the cartoons, but everything about it. The thing that's always drawn me in to this show are the weird, wonderful characters. Like the you seeing all these colors and all these just weird looking different creatures on screen together, skull face dudes and fish face dudes and all this stuff. Like all of that is really exciting and is what has always drawn me in. And there's something cool too about having like that whole swords and sorcery aspect while also like mixing in the technology. That was
Yeah,
always one of
yeah.
Master's big draws too. Like it's not just a barbarian running around swinging a sword. You've also got, like all these crazy vehicles and there's ray guns and science. It's a very science fiction type show that just happens to be set in this very like swords and sorcery barbarian setting. It's a really, really interesting amalgamation of like these different genres kind of crammed together. Like it's its own thing. And I think that's part of what a lot of people were attracted to with it.
Yeah, I mean that's always been something that I've really been attracted to in terms of that, is the combination. Because
Yeah.
obviously I think one of the things people will probably go to nowadays is the Toys That Made Us episode on Master of the Universe, and the cobbled together nature is part of the charm of
It
like, oh, we got to
is.
come up with this. As someone who's obviously dug into the world of He-Man, For people that aren't, do you think that episode is like a good representation of that toy line, or is it something where it's like, that's a story, you know?
No, I think it's a pretty good representation of it. And honestly, it does a good job of driving home how lucky Mattel was with it. You know what I mean? And not to say that like guys like Mark Taylor and them weren't doing amazing designs, because they were, but like just Mattel as a whole was scrambling to find something to compete with Star Wars because they passed up on Star Wars, right? And this
Yeah,
whole thing was like, we need something, we need something. And they sort of like, they stumbled into it, but it worked, you know, and pulling like all this stuff from other toy lines that they already done, like Big Jim, you know, they took,
yeah,
that's where
yeah,
Battle Cat comes right out of the Big Jim line, and that's why it's so big and why it doesn't match up with He-Man. But the fact that they were able to like create something so iconic just by going, yeah, that'll work. You know what I mean?
yeah,
but like now you can't think of He-Man without Battle Cat, this giant green cat as a steed, right?
yeah,
Like they
yeah.
created something iconic. So I think that episode did a really good job of showing kind of like the mentality of how the toy industry is, especially back then, where you're just looking for your next big thing, and how they kind of stumbled into it. But in the process, like got these very talented people involved who had these really cool ideas, who were very passionate about creating things. And that's how we got something so fun. And like, even when you look through that line, like looking at the history of that toy line, you can see different areas where they were trying to appeal to what was popular at the time by shoehorning something into He-Man. Like a great example to point to is when they introduced the Comet Warriors, Rock-On and Stondar, who are the rocks that transform. That
Right,
sort of
right.
thing was brought into the line because Transformers were getting popular. So they decided they needed transforming toys of some sort in the line. You know,
Yeah,
they did that sort of thing. And that's the toy industry, man.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's absolutely right. I think that's the sort of the thing that people forget, especially about that older stuff, is just throwing stuff at the wall, trying to see what sticks, and then
Right. Right.
running with it. And I think that is part of the specialness of it all. I guess comparing that to sort of stuff today, obviously, He-Man is in a very interesting sort of place in my opinion, where it's both like bigger than ever, but at the same time, it does feel like it's sort of splintered because we sort of have like all sort of fandoms. You know, you have your
Yeah.
classic old school fans, you have sort of people trying to pay homage or try to profit off of the nostalgia in a way. And
Right.
then you've got the things like the CGI cartoon on Netflix that seems to be super popular. I mean, obviously, you know, but like I go online and I almost see way more love for some of the newer, you know, let's kid oriented stuff than I do some of the stuff that's clearly aimed at collectors. And
Right.
I mean, like, why do you think that? Is it just because it speaks to the true spirit of the '80s toy line, or is it just because it's like the willingness to accept something new versus something that's like a copy of the old? Like, what do you
Yeah.
think?
I don't know. And this is something that honestly, as long as I've been doing this, I struggle to understand exactly where everybody's coming from with this sort of thing, because like I understand the nostalgia tied to all of this. Obviously, like that's why I love this so much, is because I grew up with it. But I've also always been a big proponent of, this stuff is going to die with us unless we create something new that appeals to a new generation so
Yeah,
that they can carry the torch and continue it on, right? And it really seems like there's sort of this butting of the heads of like, some people don't want it to change. They just want the things that they want it to be the way it was when they were kids, or the way they remembered it, or they only want to care about the things that matter to them as kids. And it's like, that's not wrong. But at the same time, it's like, I don't like, we're actively also like trying to stop the new stuff from happening. And that's, I don't know, that does seem wrong. You know what I mean? So it's
yeah,
like, I always tell people like, there's no wrong way to be a collector. There's no, you know, you should like what you like, but like, while you're liking what you're liking, we should let other people like the things they like too. And I think we should always be willing to like be open-minded about some of these new versions of these things, because I mean, let's face it, everything now is being marketed as this nostalgia thing that we all grew up with, right? Like
yeah,
we just got done talking about all of the creativity and everything that was going into creating the original toy line. But nowadays it feels like everything has to already be an IP, right? Everything
Yeah.
out there has to be based on something that's pre-existing. So most of the toys that we see in the toy aisles are aimed at us who are nostalgic for it in hopes that we might introduce our children to it. It
Right.
seems like that's what they're doing now. Um, and I think that's part of why there's so many splinters, right? Because like you said, there's always going to be the fan base that prefers the original toy line and only that, or only the original Filmation cartoon, or only the 2002 series because that's the one they grew up with, because
Yeah.
those people are all adults now, right?
We've reached that point,
Right.
it's we're reaching all those things.
We've hit that point. And then now with so many different types of media happening at the same time too, like I think it's like one of those things where like Mattel is trying to obviously reach out to as many people as possible. They're trying to appeal to all these different markets. They've got the Origins toy line, which is inspired by the vintage toy line. They've got the Masterverse toy line, which is supposed to be like a high-end collector toy line. They released the Revelation animated series, which is supposed to be more for old fans, but then the CGI series is supposed to be for new fans. So it's like you have all these different things that are all trying to reach different audiences, and all of these audiences are instead like holding on to the one that they like and like almost trying to fight off the other ones. It's a
Yeah.
really weird dynamic. And it's hard, it's hard to like pinpoint exactly what where everybody lies or what the issue is, or I don't know. It's tough.
No, I mean you're not wrong. I see it pretty much everywhere that I go, especially with He-Man now that it's more back than it's ever been. So I feel
Sure.
like it's really prevalent in terms of just how much it's trying to spread.
Right. But
Yeah.
like you said, it's not just He-Man, right? It's everything. It's
Oh, of
every
course.
fandom, everything that's out there. Obviously, like Star Wars is probably the best example you can give.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, as a kid of the 90s, I grew up with Phantom Menace toys and Power of the
Yeah.
Force 2 and all of that stuff. And so it's like some people grow up and they either look at that stuff in a certain way, a new way, maybe an old way. And it's now there's kids growing up with all the new Star Wars stuff. That's going to be their own thing. And it's
Right.
still
Right.
kind of baked into the old Star Wars. So it's like a huge crossover of trying to figure out who goes where with
It's
what. And
it's
yeah.
just weird. It is weird. And that's one of those things I think about it all the time, because like when we were kids, this stuff was all new, right? Like they were making all this cool new stuff. Well, like, I as a kid of the 80s, they're throwing things out at us like He-Man and Transformers and Ninja Turtles and GI Joe, and this stuff was all like new or newish.
Yeah.
GI Joe was around since the 60s obviously, but still, like,
Very
this
different
stuff,
GI Joe.
it
Yeah.
was different. This stuff was all being created for us.
Yeah.
But like I said, now everything feels so IP driven. It's almost, there's very few things that are being created for the new generation. Everything is a legacy brand at this point. And I think that is part of like why this is the way it is, like we've
Yeah.
all got us as adult collectors have these lifelong attachments to these brands. So we're going to be nitpicky, we're going to have the things that we like and we don't like. But like, it's so different for the kids, right? And it's hard to know because I'm not there with them, like, experiencing all this stuff. Like, so to them it does feel new. It is, they don't necessarily care that this has been around for 40 years before.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know.
Well, I mean, you obviously you've got a pretty good grasp on the toys themselves. Ultimately, you can never decide anybody else's sort of opinions
Yeah,
on something,
that's
but
true.
you have a sort of knowledgeable history of all this stuff. And I want to go ahead and get into sort of more of that. I want to get into more turtle stuff as well,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
turtles being
Yeah.
the other big thing. So we'll go ahead and get into that, guys, right after the commercial break here.
What do we have here?
It's Castle Grayskull.
And it's mine.
Not so fast, Beastman.
He-Man!
You can pit He-Man against Beastman, playing for the power of Castle Grayskull. You have to put the castle together.
Beastman's escaping.
The throne, Dad. Dad, you saved the castle.
Castle Grayskull from the Masters of the Universe collection.
Get out of the
away, bad dudes! It's the Turtles Party Wagon. The wacky attack van means good times for the green guys and hard knocks for the foot, especially with the tenderizer.
Yeah, and it's a big hit everywhere we go.
And look, here comes the Turtle Cycle with its working handlebar slingshot and armored sidecar.
It'll drive Shredder crazy.
Yeah, let's step on it.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Vehicles and figures each sold separately from Playmates.
And welcome back, folks. When we last left off, we were talking about the sort of He-Man brand as of right now, and you know, it's a lot going on. And I would argue that for something like Ninja Turtles, I feel like Ninja Turtles is a good sort of way to show that like a brand can really survive if you do reinvent it. It's always been my sort of example, Ninja Turtles and Batman, where people always worry about like, oh, the newest version's so different. And it's like, well, look at these characters. And Ninja Turtles really is. It's like, look how every few years we have something completely different. And, you know, they pull inspiration from either the original comics or the cartoon or whatever. Like they you know, so they influence each other. But
Right.
like, for example, Rise of the TMNT, the most recent version, is one of, if not my favorite version of the Turtles. And
awesome.
this is
Yeah.
coming from somebody that loves classic Leo. Like Leo is Cyclops from the X-Men. Like he's a leader. This new Leo is nothing like that, but I
Right.
still like him for what he is. And so you're a big turtle guy. And I feel like, especially with Turtles in the 80s, when you're introduced to it, for me, it seems really easy to sort of translate from He-Man to Turtles because of how, you know, similar in a way that they are, where you had this huge cast of colorful characters, you know, squat, beefy dudes. And the
Mhm.
Turtles are like that, especially compared to, we mentioned earlier, Transformers and G.I. Joe, different things. But Turtles almost feels like the logical evolution of someone that would be into Masters of the Universe.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what happened with me. I mean, He-Man ended and Turtles started almost right at the same times there. And it was like a natural transition for me. I was the perfect age to like coast right into Ninja Turtles. And it became my next big thing, you know, and it's still those are my two all-time favorite franchises right there. I love them both to death. And you made a really good point about Ninja Turtles. And one other thing I want to add about Turtles that is different from He-Man is Turtles is one of those brands that has never really gone away.
Yes,
It has
absolutely.
basically been there since it launched. I think the closest thing we had to it like really disappearing was the couple years between Next Mutation and the 2003 series, but still that's only like 2 years or 3 years. Basically, Turtles has never gone away. You know, they've always been able to constantly reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes to more success than others, but almost every generation since that original series is launched has had a Ninja Turtles.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to kind of see how like, you know, you brought up Rise of the Turtles. Turtles is another one of those franchises where it does feel like every time they're about to introduce a new show, you know, all the old fans are always, oh no, what have they done to my Turtles? But once it gets going, it always finds its audience.
Always. Oh,
It's always
absolutely.
been that way with Turtles. It's always been that way with Turtles.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to see. And like I said, it's varying levels of success, but still, like Turtles has always felt like a viable brand, no matter what. And they've also done a really good job with that brand of balancing out the classic stuff. Like, gosh, especially with everything that's going on right now, where you got folks like NECA and Super 7 just pumping out product based on the old cartoon and the old movies and the old toy line. It's insane how much Turtles swag is out there these days.
Oh, yeah.
But it's one of those things where I feel like I think really Viacom purchasing it was good for the brand, honestly, because they really seem to understand that there was like a legacy there and that we should be doing new stuff, but also not forgetting about the legacy of the brand. And I
Yeah.
feel they've been handling it really well. The 2012 series is my all-time favorite version of the Turtles. I loved that show. Loved it. And it was a really, I always pointed that as like one of the best ways to do a reboot. I feel like that's one of the best reboots we've ever seen of like a classic property, in the sense that it did its own thing. It was a new story for a new generation, but it was so respectful of everything that came before it that old fans could find enjoyment there. They had those moments of like the oh, you know, like you would see things and catch things or get references. And it took the characters seriously. You know, it was still fun and goofy and lighthearted because it's the Turtles, but it took the characters in the story seriously, you know, and it didn't treat the audience like they were dumb. And I think that's part of why I love that show so much. I just thought it was really, really well done. Rise is a very different thing, but I also enjoy it. My son loves Rise of the Turtles. That's his favorite version of the Ninja Turtles. And I love that. I love that for him. You know, I think that's so cool.
Yeah, that makes me really happy to hear, because I can definitely say, as someone who was, you know, into the 90s, Next Mutation was never my thing. That was
right.
you know,
wasn't a lot
wasn't
of people's, I don't
wasn't my era, but like 2003, like that was definitely the era, because my uncle was into the classic Turtles, so that was my kind of chance to get into a new animated Turtles. So I remember 2012, to sort of date things, I was in my final years of high school in 2012. So I was looking at that show and being like, this ain't it. Like,
Man, yeah, I know.
this isn't my Turtles, because I grew up with 4 kids, literally 4 kids. And then eventually you have to eat your words. And so I think whenever everyone has that moment, and some people learn, some people don't, where you start to realize like, oh, just, you got to give it a chance. You got to let it sort of grow into something. Because I think you're absolutely right. Because I was right there with people that were ready to dismiss 2012. And then eventually you start to realize of like, oh no, like this is the biggest Turtles has been in years.
Right? It's
ridiculous.
2012's popularity is comparable to the original popularity. I mean, it was
I would argue, yeah.
It was big. And that, you know, the kids that grew up with the 2012 series, I mean, that was one of those things that doesn't happen a lot in modern times, where like those toys were like flying off the shelves. You couldn't keep them in stock. Like kids wanted that stuff. Like kids wanted it. Wasn't just us. Kids wanted that stuff. So it was really cool to see. But man, I remember that too. Like I remember when they first revealed the turtle designs for that show, and everybody was just, oh my God, I can't believe they have 3 toes. 3 toes. Remember that? People were losing their mind over those designs. And then it turned into what it was. And it was very good, and it was very successful. And you're right. It's tough sometimes, because we do get a little protective of the things that we love. We all have those moments of, it was better when I was a kid, right?
Yeah.
We all have the old man thing, where things aren't as good as they used to be. And especially when there's things that we really love, we have an attachment to, and it's hard to give them a chance sometimes. But I always think about like the people who work on these shows, the people who are tasked to come up with, okay, it's your job to come up with a new version of this brand that's been around for a long time, and we need you to make it successful. Like that's got to be a lot of pressure, right? Trying to live up to like what came before. Like you have to now decide, like, how different am I going to make this? Like it's got to be popular, and like I got to try
absolutely.
do I try to please all the old fans, or do I only care about the kids? Like I can't imagine the type of pressure that's involved in something like that. So I always try to keep that in mind when I'm going into stuff like this. Like I feel, I mean, like with anything, I guess we should say this, but there's like real people behind this stuff. And I just kind of want to see what these real people are coming up with. It doesn't mean I have to like it, but I do try to like I always try to give the new stuff a chance the best I can. And it's hard. I'll admit it's hard.
Yeah, I think that is definitely the easiest thing people forget. I guess circling back to He-Man, you know, one of the biggest things was Revelation. You mentioned it earlier, the sort of clearly meant to please the older fans, but a lot of the sort of I guess vitriol I saw was coming from older fans that weren't exactly happy with it. But yeah, it was designed for like people like that in mind. But as you mentioned, there's a certain like need to protect what is, you know, a central part of people's childhood. And I totally get that. You know, as someone who can enjoy the original Filmation show for what it is, it's very fluffy and strange in its own unique way. I actually really enjoyed Revelation for what it was. It's not like my favorite cartoon or anything, but I really liked what they did with a lot of those characters. My girlfriend Ray came out of that show loving Evil Lynn for like
Oh,
especially that first half, like her and Orko, that whole storyline.
Evil
She
Lynn
loved
had
it.
the best arc in that show. Evil Lynn
Yeah.
was the best written character in that show. She was absolutely my favorite. I'm very middle ground on that series. I certainly don't hate it, but I don't love it either. You know, I'm very like middle road on it. I'm totally fine with its existence. There were things in it I liked. There were things that I didn't like, but there's one thing that I absolutely agree about. Evil Lynn, absolutely the best character in that show. I loved her portrayal. Loved it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we can all sort of take is yeah, you're right. Like you don't have to like any of this stuff. I feel like that's something that people sort of confuse when if you don't immediately hate it, it's like, well, then you must love it. Going back to the sort of toy side of things, if I
Yeah.
if I may comment on something that I saw in your particular sort of videos, when Masterverse, and we're already going back to He-Man. We started talking about Turtles and we're already back on He-Man.
We're already back.
But
It's always back to He-Man with me. I don't know.
it's it's because the turtle fans are cool and chill for the most part.
Yeah,
And,
right. Yeah. Yeah, so
but
perfect in every way, right?
for He-Man, especially when Masterverse was starting, and we
Yeah.
started a lot with those Revelation designs,
Right.
and those aren't perfect figures by any means, and I feel like they've gotten better. But especially when they first came out, the obvious thing is to compare it to classics, to compare to what we had before.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I saw a lot of people assuming in your comments saying of like, Dan, you can tell us you hate these figures. Like,
Man, it's
all
super
right.
weird. It's so weird. It's like there's always this thing where people like want to push me to like have the same thoughts as them, right?
Mhm.
And like you can be critical of things without outright hating it or even loving it. You know what I mean? Like it goes both directions. And I feel like I was very honest about how I felt about a lot of those figures. And the funny thing is like you're bringing up the people who are like pushing me that direction. I also got a lot of hate from the people who were like, you need to just let classics go. Classics is over. Stop being an old grumpy classics fan. Like it's fun. I get it from both sides. And
Yeah.
it's like it's really funny just to kind of see like where people's allegiances lie. Like they've
Yeah.
like picked a team and they just like, and I'm not like I'm not choosing any team on this. Like I'm trying to objectively look at this figure. And it is hard not to compare it sometimes. I mean, gosh dang it. I do comparison time in
I
every
was gonna
video. That's
say.
like one of my things, but like I always try to look at these figures on their own merit, and
Right.
I try to like talk about it as it is. I do usually will bring up things that I liked better about a different figure sometimes, so it's hard not to just outright compare something, but it is always funny. It's funny to see the way people like want me, like it's always that thing like I don't know, like I guess a lot of times when you're watching something, like you like it better when the person you're watching has the same opinion as you.
Right.
right, and then when you don't agree, that's when the comments are like, I disagree with what you are saying, good sir.
That's what they're saying. Yeah.
That's exactly what they say. Yeah. That's how all my YouTube comments are.
Well, I guess to bring it around, I said, from what I've seen, and maybe you are a bit more, I guess, in the trenches in terms of the turtle stuff. Do you feel like the turtle fan base has a bit more of an understanding? Maybe it is because there's that different, almost like every few years refresh. That when obviously we just described how turtles, some people can't let go of certain things, but in terms of the toys, do you feel like you have less people coming into your comment section and having that same reaction, like you compared it to the He-Man stuff? Is Turtles different?
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. I think that there were some exceptions. When the Michael Bay movies came out,
yeah,
those,
okay.
whoa, boy, people were not happy about those at all. And then when Rise first launched, there was a lot, and I think that had more to do with the 2012 series stopping and Rise directly starting. You know what I mean? There was no space in between those at all. And I feel like that caused, like, there was no time for people to like come down from the 2012 series and want something new Turtles again. Instead, people were just like, you canceled the show that I loved and made this. Like that was kind of the reaction. And so a lot of like when I reviewed because I reviewed, I think, a good chunk of the Rise figures. Unfortunately, those didn't last very long, but like right away people weren't giving those a chance, even though the toys were like really nicely made toys and they were
they're
cool
so much fun.
toys. Yeah, but people were just not willing to give those a chance because it was so different, and 2012 was so beloved, you know what I mean? So I guess those are probably the exceptions. I totally understand the Michael Bay Turtles one. But those were fun. Like, it was fun to like talk about those figures because it was just like,
Oh yeah,
this thing's as ugly as they are in the movie, you know? Like, I mean, it is what it is. But I really do think that that's a big part of the whole thing. Turtles has never really gone away, and it's always been there, and we've seen it evolve and change over the years, and people do expect it. And I think that that does have an effect on the fans' perception of when something new comes along. They don't seem to be quite as attached to theirs, in the sense that they're ready to hate the new thing.
right.
You know, He-Man was gone for a long time. A long time. And even when the Classics line was around, I mean, that Classics line was around for 10 years, but it was very niche. It was an online exclusive toy line. It wasn't in stores. A lot of people missed it or didn't know it existed. So when Origins and Masterverse and the Revelation cartoon came out, it was like the first time people had seen He-Man in 30 years.
Yeah, totally.
You know? And I think that has I think that plays a big role in a lot of the reactions we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I only knew about Classics because of people like you back in the day. And I remember Mattel did that DC Universe Classics, Mattel, the Masters of the Universe Classics, like 2-packs. They did the Superman and He-Man and Lex Luthor and Skeletor. And that's how I got those figures, was like, oh my goodness, this is a chance to like get some of these figures for the first time, because it was like the only time they were ever in store. So you're right, like He-Man definitely has that gap versus Turtles, where it is sort of sticking around. But I'd say because of that, like, now you mentioned it earlier, Turtles is being made by everyone. Like can we name every company? We've got,
I think
NECA,
every major company
Super
has
7.
touched it. Yeah.
DC Collectibles has made Turtles figures. Like, we're rumored to have McFarlane stuff.
McFarlane sounds like they're getting in on it. Yep. Hasbro did the Power Rangers Ninja Turtles. Mattel did the Mega Constructs Ninja Turtles. Literally every major toy company has touched that brand at this point. It's insane.
It's wild. I would, because I've had this thought right now, especially with the way the toy brand is going. It seems like something is going to give any second now, and I've had this feeling for a few years. And then the pandemic hit, and I was like, "This is it. Like, we're done. Like, something's gonna happen." But like, so with all these companies having this, what is your opinion on having so many different iterations at once? Like, is this, like, is it good? Is it? I mean, it is good in a way, but like, does it dilute the brand a little bit?
It's good, but it's overwhelming. And that's really what I've been feeling lately. I've always said that it's good that we have all these different options out there, because it gives people the ability to focus on what they love, you know? And it's really hard for somebody like me, where like He-Man and Ninja Turtles were always like my main focuses as far as collecting goes, because they're my two main brands. And the funny thing about that is that was pretty easy to manage until about 3 or 4 years ago, because now there's so much of both of them. It's overwhelming. It's insane. And it's like I've already given up on like trying to be a completionist, especially with Turtles, because it's not feasible these days, with costs the way they are and how quick everything is coming out. So it can be overwhelming, but I still think it's good that there are options. Like, I think it's cool that like we've hit a point where these toy companies aren't afraid to go after some of these older niche things anymore. You know, like there was a time where like, if it wasn't something that had a current movie or a current cartoon, the toy companies weren't going to bother trying to produce product for it. But now you've got, you know, NECA out there going insanely deep on the Fred Wolf Ninja Turtles cartoon, and it's blowing my mind at some of the characters that they're releasing toys of, you know what I mean? And you know, the same could be said for them doing like the original movie and Secret of the Ooze, like producing product based on these old films. Like, I think it's awesome that we're at a point where we can purchase this stuff. they're going into the Mirage comic stuff now real hard, and it's amazing. The Archie comics, I mean, they're really reaching now. Like you said, what's the breaking point? Where does this stop? Because it can't last forever. It can't. Like, we're definitely at, like, I feel like we're at this top of the bubble right now, like, where it's just like, it's really like it's all coming out. There's so much of it and it's all good, but that's going to dry up. That bubble's going to burst. These things are going to get too expensive at some point. Like, it's going to price us all out. I feel like at some point it's going to be really hard to justify buying Bugman from the original Ninja Turtles cartoon, who had one episode appearance. You know what I mean? When he's a $50 figure, and that's obviously not what he really is. I'm just saying, like, we're getting up there in some of those toys, like, and it's hard to keep up with that sort of thing. So I don't know. I think it's a good thing, but I do feel like we're at a point, and it's not just with Turtles, it's with everything toys. I feel like they all are kind of on their last hurrah right now. They're like, make everything, because we don't know how much longer this is going to last. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's what it sort of feels like. I mean, obviously, with any sort of toy line, you're going to run out of characters until you sort of recycle. You know, I feel that way with like Marvel Legends. Marvel Legends will never end, because by the time you finish a team, they've already started the new sort of styling of that same team again, where it's like, oh, you just finished this version of the X-Men, but have we introduced new super duper printing with pinless things? It's like, soon they're going to be incredible. But
that's the other thing. The technology just keeps getting better and better too with the toys. So like like you were talking about, like the pinless joints and stuff like that. Like all of a sudden, stuff you bought 5 years ago looks outdated because the technology just keeps getting better and on all these toys. Like, you know, that when they started doing the face printing thing, and then all of a sudden they had to go back and like redo everything they had already done because all the old stuff didn't look as good. It's insane. It's nuts.
Exactly. Well, as we're sort of winding down towards here, I do want to sort of mention up, because obviously you're more than Turtles, you're more than He-Man, you know, just like the people that make these cartoons that everyone loves and hates, you're a person. So in terms of other toy lines that maybe you wish you could talk about a bit more on your channel, like, obviously you're a wrestling guy. Like, for those of you who don't know, you're not just a fan of wrestling, you are a wrestler. Like, this is something where I don't know. This is something, obviously, you've been around for a while. It's something I discovered relatively recently, that you were like, oh yeah, I don't know how many people know this, and you're like posting pictures, and I had to take a double take, because it's, you know, like, being friends with people like Matt Cardona and stuff, like, it's like, that makes sense to me, where it's like, okay, similar worlds, but I don't know how this sort of slipped by everybody.
I know. Well, it's weird, and it's funny because that could be like a whole other discussion. But like, I've been doing the indie wrestling thing since like 2001, so like over 20 years, and I've just always kept it separate from the Pixel Dan thing. It always felt like it was two different worlds I was living in, and I kept them very separate. But also, things have changed so much now with like the way social media is and everything, that it's like one of those things, like, if I would have jumped in on that years ago, I could have been one of these guys that was like really actively promoting my wrestling stuff and my toy stuff with my social, but I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of like obviously there's a lot of wrestling toy lines out there. Is there one that is something that's a personal favorite of yours? Now, there are some ones that are very retro inspired that I'm sure that obviously you've made videos about, so I know you're a fan of that. But there's so many different ones out there, much like Turtles now. We're getting so many different things. Super 7 has wrestling figures. Is there a line that you focus on or you enjoy the most?
So the wrestling stuff, the one I'm actively collecting right now is the WWE Superstars line, because it's the one that's in like the 5.5s. I mean, that's just like, I mean, clearly that's a style of action figure that I like, but also I love what they're doing with it. I just love those very classic designs they're going for, and the fact that like these characters are coming with like their entrance attire and all this great. I mean, like, I think I have like Undertaker's just like sitting in my studio all the time.
Oh yeah, there you go.
He's such a cool figure. Like, this is a cool Undertaker toy. So that's been my favorite one to collect currently. I also love like the retros that they did, like the old Hasbro style WWE figures, just because like like so many out there, I have such nostalgia for those, because those are the ones that I played with as a kid all the time. I remember with all my friends in the neighborhood, we always were playing with those old Hasbro WWF figures. So those are probably my two favorites right now.
Well, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, it's totally Pixel Dan, right? It's very, very much my aesthetic.
Absolutely. Well, as someone, I guess, sort of to wrap things up here, as someone who's been in the sort of toy collecting and toy reviewing world for the longest time, you were one of the very first people that I ever saw doing this stuff. Is there something that you feel like you could, as sage advice, if you will, to people that are starting to collect and maybe wanted to start discussing this stuff online? You seem to have taken what was sort of popular and made it your own. Do you have any kind of advice that would spin about that for younger people that want to get into this stuff?
Sure, sure. So, I mean, it's a very different world now. There's a lot of people out there that are all doing the same kind of thing now. So it's hard to stand out. I do consider myself pretty lucky that I was one of the first ones to do this because it was easier to stand out back then. But everybody's on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and everything now. So the thing that I always tell people when they ask me like for advice on like how to do this, I always just tell them that like, and maybe this sounds cliche, but it is the best thing you can do is to care about what you're talking about.
Right.
If it's something that you're genuinely passionate about, that will shine through in your videos and people will find so much more enjoyment in watching you. Like that is how you hook your audience. Care about the things that you're talking about. So that's the best advice I can give.
I mean, that's good advice. So, I mean, Dan, I want to thank you for sort of being here. This was something where I felt like a long shot sort of approaching you and being like, hey, can we do something like this? And you were totally kind to sort of come on here and answer these questions. And I hope you had fun because I had a lot of fun doing
Good,
this.
man.
So.
Yeah, no, I had a great time. I apologize for rambling about He-Man so much. It's just
that's what people are here for. They've never heard you talk about He-Man before. But go ahead, plug your socials, your channel. As if people don't know that already. Go ahead and tell them where to find you if this is
Sure.
for whatever reason their first time seeing you on this channel.
Sure. So obviously my main source of content is over on YouTube. Just do a search for Pixel Dan and you'll come across my channel there. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, also at Pixel Dan. And you can check out my book, The Toys of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, over on Amazon or just bug your local bookstore. They should be able to order it for you.
All right. Thanks again, man.
Yeah, thank you so much, man.
So there you guys go. That was my sort of interview with Pixel Dan, and it was a lot of fun, as you can imagine. He was really nice to sort of let me dig into his sort of world of toy reviewing and his opinions on things, so I really appreciate it, Dan. Make sure to check out his channel. Just search Pixel Dan on YouTube. I'm sure you can go ahead and find it. And he's also, I think he said his socials, actually, in the end of the video. If not, I'll put it in the description. But thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to check out some of my other content as well if you like it. I do reviews, collection videos, all sorts of cool stuff. I'm at Anthony Lantern on Instagram and Twitter. Subscribe if you like. Do all that YouTube stuff. That's really all I got to say. But thank you so much for watching. Take care.